You know that my grandmother was visiting us here in Switzerland during the summer,
Is this when
and
you
when
made
she
her walk 5 miles up a mountain in an hour?
she loved it, uh, and when she was here, I was asking her about trips that she'd done with my grandfather in Europe because they came quite a lot of times, and she's been all over the place. But no matter how much I asked her about it, I'd be like, "Oh, can you tell me about your trips through Italy?" She had no idea where she'd been. The only things that she could tell me were like, "Oh, I really like that city that had those markets with the great oranges, or the markets with the tomatoes, or the markets with the grape." Turns out the markets with the oranges was Florence.
Wow.
Yeah, my grandparents might like markets a bit too much, but even then, I think it's their love of markets is quite representative of a broader love for markets or broader relevance of markets in Mexico City life.
Yes, ultimately, when we think of a market in Mexico City, we think of el tianguis, right? Which is this old concept from pre-Hispanic times. It comes from the Nahuatl, and it just means an outdoor market. And it's mostly, when we talk about tianguises, we talk about temporary markets, but not. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It's just a sort of style of market that we've all come to know and love. The red tarp that makes the oranges look even more orange. The food that you get, like you can buy it there, the sort of like raw chicken just like slabbed there on a hot day, and or like the shrimp cocktail you're having, and you're not quite sure where it came from, but it's the best one you've had.
Even though there's no sea close to Mexico City, but there you go. It's still the best cocktail you've had.
Although ironically, I'd say that what's weird about these great central metropolises. I don't know what's the plural of that. Anyway, the great thing about these massive centralized cities is that they do concentrate unfairly for everyone else. Some of the best produce, at least in the region, right? Like the best fish in Spain tends to be found in Madrid, say people from Madrid at least. And you could argue that a lot of the best produce that you can get from all around Mexico can be found in Mexico City because it concentrates such a massive market. Like both, like literally the market conceptually, the amount of people, but also a literal massive market in La Central de Abastos, which we'll be talking about later on, which concentrates the best produce because it's not only that there's loads of people there, it's also the competition and who can get it the cheapest and the freshest. And it actually leads us down a weird rabbit hole, an economic rabbit hole that we can get into later on, which leads to the massive protests we've seen recently of produce growers and farmers protesting the fact that their prices have plummeted in recent months and they've been blocking roads very much because of this competition that they've had with each other, driving down prices and then finding that it's actually more profitable to not grow fruit at this point than to grow it.
Yeah, I mean that's a massive rabbit hole, but it's definitely one of the great problems of these colossal markets that concentrate huge amounts of production from all over the country, as is the case definitely in Mexico City. But today we're going to be focusing more broadly on Mexico City and its markets, not just the Great Central de Abastos and some of the other great massive markets, but there are well over 300 public markets plus the thousands of tianguis that constitute a very, very important part not only of commercial and economic life in Mexico City, but of broader cultural and social life of the city.
But of course, we can't be Mexico the podcast and not start in the dawn of time. But it's worthwhile, dear listeners, because we're going to start 13 years after the founding of the great city of Tenochtitlan. 13 years after it was founded in 1325, we saw the creation of Tlatelolco, which was one of the many, many, many cities that surrounded the Great Lake at the center of what is today Mexico City. And Tlatelolco became famous because it became the great commercial center of the valley. Mexican pre-Hispanic culture works a lot in dichotomy. That's why we get the name Mexico Tenochtitlan. And similarly, we had a dichotomy between the political and cultural and religious center, which, to be honest, was the same thing back then. Cultural, religious, and political were basically concentrated in one Tlatuani. It was the one centralized space for that. And then on the other side, you had the more mundane, but equally powerful commercial center. And that was Tlatelolco. The greatest market in pre-Hispanic America was the city of Tlatelolco, where they had a temporary market where people from all over Mesoamerica, sometimes bringing jade from as far north as New Mexico, current-day New Mexico, and exotic plumes from places like Guatemala today, agglomerating in Mexico City as the great center of population and power at the time.
There's a marvelous quote that people who grew up in Mexico tend to hear a lot, but for listeners who don't know it, I think it's a wonderful description of the market in Tlatelolco, as said by the chronicler Bernal Díaz del Castillo, who was part of Hernán de Cortés' group when he arrives in Tenochtitlan. He says, "When we arrived at the great marketplace called Tlatelolco, we were astounded at the number of people and the quantity of merchandise that it contained. Among us, there were soldiers who had been in many parts of the world, in Constantinople, all of Italy and Rome, and they said that such a well-placed square with so much harmony and full of such a large crowd they had never seen before."
And it's a constant in Mexico, right? The enormity of its markets, that continues to this day, but we've got that very historic and traditional basis for that, which is the tianguis in Tlatelolco. We have inherited that tianguis from Tlatelolco across Mexico, but Mexico City continues to be that great center of commerce on that scale for the tianguis. I kept on worrying, is this going to be too much of a Mexico City-centric episode? And the answer is yes, but also I don't feel bad about it anymore because so many of the great Mexican stories around markets, around tianguises, are based in Mexico City simply because, as we said, this is where the market is. However, I will say that the oldest continuous market lies outside of Mexico City, probably because the devastation of the Spanish conquest erased a lot of those spaces, and then they had to be recreated, often on a pre-Hispanic basis, but they were rebuilt afterwards in a new version of themselves. Whereas in Chilapa, Guerrero, they've had 600 years of continuous sales. What's interesting to me and sort of devastating at the same time is brings us to the first key element, sort of the first symptom of markets in Mexico, which is the violence and the lack of safety around them. And it makes perfect sense, right? It's a confluence of people sometimes out from outside of the city, so there's no bonds of trust. You don't know them. They're outsiders. There's a lot of money flowing. And of course, there's a lot of temptation for gambling, prostitution, and crime, and the buying and selling of illegal products. Chilapa, Guerrero, with its great market, its oldest market, is in the top 2% most violent municipalities in the country today. But it's not alone, right? It's also accompanied by also famously violent places. Probably the most famous, coming back to Mexico City, is Tepito, known as El Barrio Bravo, which, I mean, how would you translate that, Tavo?
The bravest place. No.
The rough neighborhood.
The rough neighborhood, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. The rough neighborhood of Tepito. And it's earned its name because it is famously violent. It is a place where you can get, sure, your produce, but also if you want a slab of lion meat or a live lion, if you ask in advance, loads of drug dealing. And it's a place that is famous for being pretty dodgy.
I mean, the Tepito is historic, and this has been for a very, very long time. I mean, like my grandmother was actually born and grew up in historic Mexico City, not too far from Tepito. But even back then, her family already considered Tepito a place that was just an absolute no-go. Which is very sad because Tepito dates back to the Aztec city, to the great Aztec city. It's one of the places where the last stand of the Aztecs happens against the Spanish, and yet it is now only known as a profoundly dangerous neighborhood.
It brings us back to this point, right? It's dangerous because it is a place where a lot of things can be bought and sold. And yet also it brings us to the other point about markets, which is they do kind of have to be near where you buy and sell, where people need it, right? The supply and demand, it's about where you're placed as well as what you're selling. And it's always interesting to me, especially when you're in downtown historic Mexico City, which used to concentrate the whole city until pretty much the mid-20th century. What's sort of funny to me is when when a foreigner asks me, so is downtown safe or is it dangerous? And my answer is always yes, because ultimately it's both. Like within a couple of blocks, it can go from incredibly posh to quite dangerous because you've got that microcosm of what Mexico City used to be. Tepito is just a few blocks north of the historic, incredibly touristy central square of El Zócalo. But it makes sense, right? If that's where the people are, that's where you want to be selling things. Of course, this didn't sit well with the Mexican government in the 20th century, especially as Mexico City was growing enormously. And so you get a big movement by the Mexican government to move these very dangerous and unruly markets out of downtown and into a place where they can be more readily controlled, or at least shoved into working class neighborhoods. And that's more or less the origins of the Central de Abastos. How would you translate that, Tavo?
The central of where you get your stuff, basically.
Yeah, stuff town.
Exactly.
And it really is a town. It is a titanic building, or complex. How would you describe it?
I think the stats speak for themselves. It's 327 hectares, basically, of like warehouses that are interconnected. There's multiple parking lots, multiple entrances. There's parking lots for large trucks, for medium trucks, for small trucks, for cars. It's a city, and both in size, but also in just the sheer number of people that go in every day. On peak days, there's as many as 500,000 people in those 327 hectares in a single day.
Yeah, and the numbers when it comes to the money are also staggering. They trade in about $10 billion a year, which makes it, after the Mexican Stock Exchange, the largest flow of money in the entire country. A third of Mexico's produce is sold there every single day. And what is hilarious to me is that after they moved it in the 1980s, so when they inaugurate it on the 22nd of November, 1982, and a few years later, it's basically considered a failure, which I think is classic Mexico and always something to worry about when you hear critics of the government. People look at these massive projects, and if they're not a success within the first few years, it's considered a failure. No one's moving to the Central de Abastos. Why would anyone want to move to Iztapalapa? It's far from the center. It used to be on the sort of muddy wetlands, which was, by the way, an environmental disaster. Lots of sort of Mexico's 1980s ecological movements were focused on stopping the Central de Abastos from being built there. We've forgotten it completely, except for every time it rains, when the entire area completely floods, putting Mexico's food supply at risk. But even then, people eventually did move, and towards the end of the 90s, it was already pretty much saturated. So as we were talking before we turned the cameras on and the microphones on, Tavo was pretty surprised that it was still only, quote unquote, $10 billion a year, when it had been $9 billion just a few years ago, and surely it must have grown since then. Ultimately, we concluded that the whole point was firstly, the Mexican peso has fallen since then, so it's still probably way more pesos than it is dollars. But also, it's completely saturated now. That's a very, very big issue with the Central de Abastos. And you're starting to see the same old issues that arose in the previous versions of the markets, which is more violence, lots of sort of, they call it focos de infección, sort of areas where there's lots of rubbish and infectious points, they call them.
But that's not really a problem. It's not like we had COVID a couple of years ago that might have been linked to a market as well.
Yes, exactly. I mean, COVID was such a sad story for the Central de Abastos because you sort of saw how it works through the tragedy of who died. Like, for some reason, just because I guess the way they move, the way it works, obviously the market stayed open, because if you close the market, the city starves. And so people kept going to the market. And for some reason, like the pandemic was devastating to the tomato sellers, for example, versus the carrot sellers who were more or less unscathed. And those little sort of micro stories show you how this is basically a city within a city. They have their own libraries. It's not part of the business of the Central de Abastos. It's literally just a borrowing library where you can come up, you write your name down, and they give you a book. It's completely based on trust. So there's this weird dichotomy between, sure, the lack of safety, but also this incredible community that is formed in those massive hallways that make up La Central de Abastos.
I think it's interesting. This happens a lot in Mexico. You already mentioned it, just the enormity of things. I remember back when Marcelo Ebrard was the governor of Mexico City, or the jefe de gobierno, now Minister of Economics under Sheinbaum. He was invited to this big council of presidents of rich nations, but he was invited even though he was the governor of a city. And the reason was that, or the reason given, was that Mexico City in many ways operates like a country, because the greater Mexico City is enormous, and there's so many people that it's incredibly complex. So it requires all the complexity sometimes of countries. And I think La Central de Abastos can be described in a similar way. I talked about 500,000 people on peak days, but on a normal day, it's over 300,000 people there. Geneva City, just as an example, sometimes called the smallest metropolis in the world, has 200,000 people. This is a market with 300,000 people. It's extraordinary.
And so the governance needs to be at that level of sophistication. It's fascinating because it's basically a public-private trust where the government, the Mexico City government, back then led by Marcelo Ebrard, today led by Clara Brugada, she is basically like the president of that trust, but it's still very much public-private. And you can very much see why you definitely need both the government and the market in there working together. The market, literally because it is a market, you do need the buy-in, sometimes literally in terms of like the money they invest in the space of the private sphere. But if you leave them alone, it gets pretty rowdy. I mean, there's so much money moving around that it can get pretty tense amongst the private. So you do need the government to come in and sort of separate them. The weirdest one to me was a few years ago, two parking companies who had two different parking spots in the Central de Abastos, because obviously they've got loads, because you've got to park there, the massive trucks, etc. These two companies literally came to physical blows. Like they set their staff out to fight in the parking space for control of parts of the parking space because they wanted the money, because they charge you a bit of money to park there. And there's just so much money in this that ultimately it's worth getting to a bit of a fight to take control of your patch of the market.
That scene is reminiscent of Gangs of New York.
Yes.
Just like the workers just charging at each other.
Oh, wait. I mean, ultimately, it was taken over by the government. And then the government said, well, we're just going to take control of the parking from now on. And people were quite happy.
But it's as you say, I don't know if it's still the case, but until 2016, around 85% of all the food and goods that came into Mexico City came in through La Central de Abastos. So you need the government to step in, because if that thing doesn't work, the city stops functioning.
Yes, exactly. And the problem, of course, that we're now facing is the Central de Abastos is Titanic, but it's still not Titanic enough for Mexico City. I mean, just before we move on, because the whole point of me saying that it's not big enough for Mexico City means that we get to talk about the other markets with other functions across the metropolis. One of the last things that I wanted to mention is because it's a city within a city, it sometimes provides sort of trades with the rest of the city in interesting ways beyond the produce. The most interesting one to me is that it's so big that they've created a massive solar farm on top of the Central de Abastos, which provides the metro system across the rest of Mexico City with electricity.
I mean, it's high time that they did something like that. I did not know about that, and that's super cool that they've done it. But 327 hectares of warehouses in one of the sunniest places in the world. Yes, that's just sensible public policy.
So the Central de Abastos isn't big enough for the city. And so you get a bunch of other pretty big and at least pretty famous markets. So you get famous flower markets, you get famous specialized food markets in touristy places. You get Pepito, of course. You get La Lagunilla, which is a weekend market close to Tepito, famously kind of rough as well, but now become touristy. It's sort of like a gentrified version of that rough neighborhood experience where you can go buy antique furniture and clothing. So it's a flea market that hipsters love.
It's very sort of Portobello Road. What I think is interesting, so we mentioned before, there's over 300 of these public markets. That's without counting the thousands of sort of street markets that pop up in the course of the month, in the course of a week. Some of them stay forever, as happens often around, for example, the historic center. Then those are usually referred to as tianguis, right? Even though the original tianguis in Nahuatl refers to a market, a gathering place. Beyond the thousands of tianguis, there's roughly 200 and a few fixed public markets that are just neighborhood markets, and they're big, but they're not that big. But there's around 80 specialized markets. Some of them are massive, and they focus on food, like, for example, Mercado de la Merced in the historic downtown. There's the Mercado de San Juan, specialized also in all sorts of gourmet food and weird food. If you're looking for scorpions and tarantulas, that's the place to go. Mercado de Jamaica, which is flowers. the Mercado de Sonora, if you're looking for some copal to do some, a little bit of the occult. Copal is a sort of incense that is burnt in a variety of ceremonies in Mexico. That's where you get it. And you have all these markets that cater to very, very specific needs. The Lagunilla, as you mentioned, Alex, I love because it's a place where you can find just weird stuff for like decorating, tons of antiquities, but unclear they're actually antiquities, they're just things. And then you can also find some true gems. So like the real sort of big antiquities dealers in Mexico. Sure, there's a big market in La Colonia Juarez, but a lot of that is sourced in La Lagunilla, where you can find top-notch art, colonial era furniture, paintings, extraordinary things. So these markets are just a fantastic ecosystem to explore.
And going back to those thousands of temporary markets that will, literally close down a big road and everyone just accepts it because it's the place. They've come to you, right? The mountain has come to Mohammed. And so even in the poshest neighborhoods, and the price reflects it, you can get some pretty massive markets completely taking over main roads and everyone's happy with it. And amongst that chaos, though, there's a lot of order. The sort of governance of these local markets is interesting because it's different from obviously the trust that runs the Central de Abastos. But it's also got a lot to do with the government, right? The government gives the permission to close the road. It also charges them to set up shop. They sort of pay a bit of like rent to set up shop. And so it's basically by square meter, and it depends what you sell, that they'll charge you. And there's a man, often with fistfuls of cash, walking around the market, and that person is the person in charge of charging you when you've set up shop. What's sort of weird is, sure, sometimes it's the same old people, but it's a good place to make a bit of money if you're on your way through. And so you'll see interesting Haitian or Venezuelan like people with blankets setting up, and as long as they pay, as long as there's space and they pay their due to the government man or woman walking through with the fistfuls of money, they can set up shop and sell their wares as well.
That's fantastic. That's something I really like about these markets. So I used to frequent the Polanco market, which is a notoriously posh market because it's a notoriously posh neighborhood. But even there, you had a mix. Like, sure, you had like these stalls that had obscenely expensive fruit. Just made, if you had any sense of prices in the country, like that made no sense because the quality wasn't that much better. It was just more expensive. But if you just walked a little bit further and went behind that stall, you could find a stall that sold fruit and vegetables, top quality, at much more reasonable prices. So you get the whole, obviously there's a bias by how posh the neighborhood is and what kind of prices you'll see. But even within one same market, you will get a whole range of prices and a whole range of options that also are reflective of the range of consumers that will go to the market.
That's what annoys me about what we're going to talk about next, because there is space in the poshest of areas in Mexico City for a traditional tianguis. These are working class people who bring their wares, and they bring you the best produce maybe, or the most exotic fruits. Like, for example, you won't find okra in normal Mexican life. Or maybe nowadays, yes, because of all the African and Haitian migrants who enrich our culture and cuisine. But back in the day, it was difficult to find at least large amounts of okra in different parts of Mexico City, except for, like in the posher parts with more expats and foreigners. What's interesting to me is that these spaces clearly weren't enough conceptually for some of the more, I don't know, we'll call them snobbish parts of Mexico City. And so in 2014, you get the creation of a new thing, a new sort of Mexico City market, which is inspired in foreign markets, gourmet markets. And this one was created in 2014 in La Colonia Roma. So Roma, if anyone who's come from abroad to Mexico City knows it, because it's where you're basically sent. It's where all the Americans now agglomerate, and it's difficult to hear Spanish spoken in the streets because of the amount of tourists that concentrate there. But what's interesting to me is that you read up the inauguration of Mercado Roma, and people instantly knew that it was a force for gentrification because it broke with the traditional concept of the Mexican market. It was gourmet, which is a bit of a dog whistle, I'd say, because as you well said, El Mercado San Juan Market, is already a gourmet market with, weird and wonderful cuisines, but lots of the people who set up shop there, for example, a very famous one is a Sinaloan fishmonger / seafood restaurant called Don Vergas. That is now a franchise of Mexican restaurants across Mexico City. It started out as a gourmet restaurant in San Juan. But when Mercado Roma comes about in 2014 and says it's the first gourmet market in Mexico, that's a dog whistle for we don't quite want the same sorts of people in our market as the usual Mexican market. And so they've imported the concept from Borough Market, from New York, from Spain, from Madrid, and they've brought it to Mexico. And it's a beautiful building in the center of this traditionally middle class, but now very gentrified area. But what, again, is weird is back then the conversation wasn't about Americans. In fact, one of the articles I read from 2014 was that the big difference between the gentrification process that Mercado Roma brought to Mexico versus other gentrification processes that were brought into London and New York through these gourmet markets was that there was the absence of foreigners. No one was being pushed out who wasn't already there before. It was just a different dynamic. The arrival of rich Mexicans pushing out traditional working class and middle class Mexicans. And it's sort of weird to see the interviews as well, because they're saying things that you'd never say now for fear of being cancelled. But back 10 years ago, or over 10 years ago, that was fine. It was fine for you to say, we're building a place of a better class of place. We're building it with people who are trained outside of Mexico to bring gourmet flavors. And it's very jarring to see, but it's very much the seed of that gentrification process, at least in that part of La Roma, which is now completely grown out of proportion and is almost exclusively blamed on Americans, but I would argue far precedes them.
That is infuriating. And it also makes no sense. I remember the first time I went to Borough Market, probably 2010, I was there and I thought, this looks a lot like a Mexico City market. It's just different stuff because they're not going to be selling carnitas. This is fried pork meat. But it's fair. And now, actually, the last time I was in Borough Market was last year, and there was plenty of fried pork meat. So they're not that different to start, right?
Well, we've been discussing whether or not this is an anachronism or anything. But what we always think about when we talk about the Spanish conquest of Mexico is actually that this is very much part of the Columbian exchange. And the Columbian exchange is, sure, you get people, animals, and crops coming from, and diseases coming from Europe, but you get exactly the same process going back. And a lot of this is cultural exchange as well, right?
Yes, definitely. And it's one of those things where, as we mentioned, the tianguis, which was the Aztec word, or Nahuatl word for a market, can be translated as a gathering place or a meeting place, right? This was like meeting and having these massive squares, yes, of commerce, but also of congregation, was a core part of Mesoamerican culture. And I always find it interesting that you don't get these massive squares in every single town, like as the standard place of congregation in other parts of Europe and many other parts of Europe. So it's not the staple of, say, Britain, not necessarily the staple of France, even though obviously public squares exist. But if you go to Spain, you do see it. So obviously Salamanca or Madrid or Sevilla have these massive squares. But I've always wondered, to what degree did one influence the other? Obviously, the square of Salamanca already existed since long before the Spanish came to Mesoamerica. But knowing that these markets were a core part of the Aztec Empire, they were a core part of the Mixtec and the Zapotec kingdoms, this must have influenced Europe as well. Madrid, as we know it today, is reconstructed in the course of the 19th century. So the squares that we know today weren't necessarily exactly that would have existed a few hundred years ago. And in that reimagining of those squares, I find it difficult to believe that there isn't sort of, yes, there is a flow of Spanish ideas into Mesoamerica, but there's also a flow of Mesoamerican ideas into Spain. And if even the Spanish said that they'd never seen a market quietly, the Tlatelolco market, I insist that there must be an important amount of influence. So when you say that the Mercado Roma was trying to bring markets from abroad to Mexico, I feel in many ways they were just trying to re-import something that in many ways started there.
Reinventing the tianguis, absolutely. Maybe we don't know about whether or not the tianguis influenced Spanish urban layouts, but we definitely know that Mexican market culture has influenced the rest of the world. The concept of the food truck is very, very clearly traceable to Mexican migrants selling tacos and, Mexican food in Southern California. That is clearly traceable. So the influence of Mexican markets and Mexican street food culture is very much with us, not only in Mexico, but all around the world. And I, for one, don't feel I need to go to a posh part of Borough Market or La Roma to have the full experience, the full gourmet experience.
Now, there's something particularly magical about markets in general, but as someone who grew up spending a lot of time in the Mexico City markets, if you're ever in Mexico City, you need to visit these markets for the food, gourmet or otherwise, for the antiquities, for the potentially adventurous experience of Tepito, for the flowers, for the copal. The number of experiences that one can have in these places is extraordinary, and some of them are quite unique.
And it's very difficult to gentrify because there's so many and they're so big that there aren't enough American tourists to fill out the enormity of Mexico City's markets.
This was Tavo Figueroa.
And I'm Alex Gonzalez-Ormerod.
This is Mexico, the podcast.
Every 2 weeks, we're bringing you stories about Mexico, its politics, its economics, and where people are getting their finest produce.
Subscribe to the Mexico Political Economist. Leave us a comment. Give us a like.
And for now, toodaloo.